Welcome to Terrifying Ways to Go, a series in which we delve into some of the darkest corners of human existence, exploring the chilling and often disturbing ways in which people have met their untimely demise. From freak accidents to bone-chilling murders, each episode will take us on a journey through some of the most sinister and horrifying true stories of our time. So buckle up and ride along as we venture out into the abyss, trying to make sense of all of this madness. But I must warn you, this series is not for the faint of heart. In this episode, we will be looking at 3 separate yet equally terrifying true instances of maritime disasters. Number 1, the Paria pipeline disaster, otherwise referred to as the Trinidad diving incident of 2022. So back in February of 2022, 5 divers working for LMCS Limited are performing work on a 30-inch U-shaped pipeline located just off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, although this line has been inactive for a while, its intended use is to allow tankers to transfer crude oil towards a processing facility located on land. With that in mind, their task involved placing a riser onto the seaside vertical section of this pipeline while working in a hyperbaric chamber. Essentially, this is a cap that sits around the pipe that is then filled with air in order to give them a dry working environment. In addition to this, before their work can begin, they must remove a flange bolted on top of the pipe, in accordance with one of possibly 2 plugs that may have been in the pipe. Now, while the exact number of plugs is not known at this time, what is known is that one of those plugs was to remain inside of this pipe while work was being performed. Regardless, as soon as the plug is removed, the chamber fills with water as all 5 men are sucked into the pipe, tumbling 60 feet down, slamming into that 90-degree bend, all the while being pulled further and further away from the chamber. Moreover, all their equipment had been dragged in with them, meaning the entire time they are tumbling through this pipe, they're just getting beaten and pummeled with random objects. Now, after everything had calmed down, they then group up and begin making their way back towards the entrance, but some of the men are just simply too injured to move on, and it was at this point one of those 5 divers, Chris Bodrum, leaves the group and starts making his way back to that 90-degree bend. And upon doing so, he gets his head above the water and begins calling out for help, but there was no one there. Now here's the thing. Although a call was immediately sent out stating they lost communication with the men, it would take roughly 3 hours for 2 divers to get there from another location. Well, upon arriving, they are shocked to find not a single rescue effort is being made. More so, it's like everyone is just going about their daily business and nothing is being done. So it was at this time they mounted their own rescue operation, only to be greeted with orders to stay up top. And needless to say, against company wishes, they grab some tether, head on down, and enter the chamber. They then pull Chris out, and one of those 2 men, Michael Kerbin, enters the pipe, but unfortunately he runs out of tether before he's able to locate anyone else. He then heads back up in an effort to link more tether in order to go back down, but he will be stopped by the Coast Guard along with all further rescue attempts until they could 100% ensure the safety of any divers entering that pipe. Therefore, it is with a heavy heart, I must tell you, no further rescue efforts would be made. As a matter of fact, 3 days later, they would open one section of the pipeline and proceed to flush it until all the bodies just simply came out. Further investigation would find the pipe had a much lower pressure than the atmosphere of the hyperbaric chamber. Therefore, when the plug came loose, that air had no choice but to flow down into the pipe, while at the same time filling the chamber with water and pulling the men inside. This is what is referred to as delta P pressure. Needless to say, there was immediate public and international outcry over the lack of rescue efforts for these men. Official cause of death: drowning. Number 2, the Byford Dolphin incident. Alright, so with everything going on about the Ocean Gate submersible and its catastrophic implosion, I think it's worth pointing out this is the first time in history you've actually seen something like this happen. And while yes, the outcome and science behind it is absolutely terrifying in its own way, I'd like to remind you we do have an equally horrifying and documented account of what occurs to the human body during rapid depressurization, the result of which is absolutely horrifying, as the Norwegian deep-sea drilling crew found out back in 1983. But before we get into the gritty details, there's some basic information we should know in order to better understand the situation. That being said, saturation divers can earn anywhere between $40,000 and $60,000 a month. But that's not to say the industry doesn't come with its fair share of horror stories. I mean, the job is not for the faint of heart and is among one of the most dangerous professions anyone could possibly have. Now, essentially, when diving, the deeper you go, the more nitrogen within your body will begin to compress. In turn, your body will begin to take on more nitrogen in an effort to fill this void. And upon returning to the surface, you have to perform what are known as decompression stops. This gives that nitrogen in your system enough time to properly dissipate, thus being released as you continue to breathe air. Now, skipping these steps can result in what is known as the bends, which causes fatigue as well as extremely painful body aches. And ultimately, what's going on here is this rapid change in pressure causes all of that nitrogen to expand back to the size it would be at sea level. quite literally bubbling up inside of you, which is what causes that pain. And well, the crew aboard the Byford Dolphin have been working at roughly 290 feet. That being said, if they were to take regular decompression stops during their shift, each one of those stops would be like 6 to 8 hours, meaning it's not feasible for them to do this in between every shift. Therefore, they just stay under working pressure for like 2 to 3 weeks at a time. Which leads us to November 5th of 1983. A group of 4 divers, Edwin Coward, Roy Lucas, Troels Helvik, and Bjorn Bergersen, have been working on and off at depths of around 290 feet. Or 9 atmospheres. Well, sometime around 4 a.m., while Bjorn and Troels have been working on an oil well, a call comes in about inclement weather heading their way, and it was at this point the 2 men were ordered to re-enter the diving bell and begin their ascent to the surface. Next thing you know, the bell is being hoisted out of the water with a crane, and the process of docking begins as they are attached to the trunk of the chamber. The process goes as follows. Exit the dive bell, closing the door behind you. Slightly increase pressure in diving bell to seal door tightly. Close chamber 1 door. Slowly depressurize the trunk until it reaches a pressure of 1 atmosphere. And lastly, open the clamp to separate the diving bell from the chamber system. But what actually occurred would go down in history as one of the most disturbing and graphic incidents in the history of the profession. Bergersen and Helvik had just made their way out of the bell and were in the process of entering the main chamber, when all of a sudden, all 4 divers are instantaneously eviscerated. Bits and pieces would quite literally fly about 30 feet away from the bell. Essentially, all of those gases that had been compressed inside their tissue, their bones, their blood, their brain, expanded so quickly they were blown to bits. Further investigation would find the change in pressure to be so great, fat had literally separated from tissue, eyes had been blown out of sockets, and only one of the 4 men was even somewhat visually recognizable. In addition to this, the dive bell shot off into the distance along with a bunch of other material, taking the life of one of the dive tenders. Barton Saunders, which is this person right here, would live but not without sustaining serious injuries of his own. Now think about this for a second. All of this occurred from a change of 8 atmospheres. And when we apply what we know about this incident to the more recently and notable Ocean Gate incident, those guys were at a depth of 12,500 feet or an astounding 400 atmospheres. This gives you a pretty good indicator of just how insane it is to actually travel to these depths. Well, lastly, it would take years for the families of these men to actually receive any sort of compensation from the incident, and in some cases, those payouts were as little as $100,000. Regardless, the Byford Dolphin incident has essentially become the poster child, so to speak, of just how quickly things can go wrong in this industry. Lastly, we have number 3. K-141, the depths of no return. So back in August of 2000, a Russian nuclear-powered sub known as the K-141 Kursk had been performing a training exercise in the Barents Sea, which, for those of you who don't know, is located within the Arctic Circle. Well, at some point during this training, they load a dummy torpedo, and it was at this time a highly volatile substance known as high-test peroxide began leaking from a faulty weld on said warhead, when all of a sudden, an explosion rings out throughout the sub as they begin taking on a substantial amount of water due to the fact the inner and outer doors of the torpedo tube have been completely blown apart. In addition to this, the initial explosion would claim the lives of everyone in the control room as well as the torpedo room itself. And while yes, this in and of itself is a major issue, they have yet another problem. A flash fire is now rapidly consuming the remaining compartments of the vessel, growing ever closer to its bow where they store the actual warheads, when roughly 2 minutes later, a second and much larger explosion involving 5 to 7 actual warheads blows off the entire nose of the sub. Now, while the Kursk did have a total of 9 compartments, it is said that at this point, any crew members located within the first 6 had either passed away as a result of the secondary explosion or would have been completely submerged in water within less than a couple of minutes. And this is where things get even more disturbing. 23 of the initial 118-man crew were able to make their way to the 9th and final compartment, where they would then seal themselves off into darkness as the ship lost power and landed on the seafloor roughly 350 feet below. And while there was an escape hatch in this section, there was just simply no way anyone would have been able to make it to the surface. The events that followed are what made this one of the most controversial non-wartime military disasters of all time. During the initial rescue attempts, consistent banging could be heard coming from the hull of the ship, and while several attempts were made by Russian teams to rescue these men, they would all prove to be unsuccessful, as time and time again they would fail to latch onto the hatch. Another 5 days would go by while Putin would repeatedly decline assistance from multiple nations around the world that had placed specialized teams on standby to assist with the situation. Unfortunately, by the time he accepted help, it was all but too late. The banging had long since stopped and the men had all perished. It wasn't until roughly a year later a Dutch recovery specialist would pull this up to the surface for a hefty price tag of $44 million. And while there is much debate on exactly how long those men survived, some experts believe it could have been 24 to 36 hours. Lastly, it's worth pointing out, there are a couple of other theories as to how the initial explosion happened, but it is also worth noting there is much less evidence to support those theories. So that's it, y'all. That is going to do it for this episode of Terrifying Ways to Go. We sincerely hope you have an amazing whatever it is, wherever you may be. Peace out.